I think we should get started. What do you guys think? I'm really very grateful that these videos are enjoyed and watched later. If you can't watch these, you know you can go on to our YouTube videos and get all of those. Um, it's really fun to see people use it and appreciate it. So if you have a topic that you want to talk about, or if you want something to say, just raise your hand or put it in the text and I'll take a look at it. But today, this video is born from kind of what I saw in a recent closing where it started getting a little ugly and it hasn't totally been resolved, but I want to give you the snapshot. I'll kind of catch you up to speed on what this closing was like, what we did to hopefully resolve it, and then, some of the other things that we can use to figure some of this out. It's all about putting some tools into your toolbox, give you the chance to close deals without it getting frenzied or confrontational. That's the goal. Don't let it get confrontational. Keep communication, really good. Um, and anytime I start seeing things go off the rails, because I'm not perfect, sometimes I can make that same mistake. You have to be willing to raise your hand and step up to the plate. So let me give you this scenario first. So we had a FAR bar as is sales contract. And in this case, the seller chose my firm to do the closing. So we pulled title, and like we always do nowadays, we also pulled the permits, we pulled lien searches, we did kind of all that stuff. We looked for water bills, we looked at everything. Well, in this particular property, we didn't get the permit search back very quickly. In Collier County, I can get it back same day. City of Naples, I can pull that pretty much the same day, but this was out of our typical wheelhouse. This was up in Lee County, City of Cape Coral. It took a couple of more days than normal. Still very reasonable. As soon as we got the contract, I think we had the permit search back within 5 or 6 days. We turned around and we gave it to the buyer and the seller that same day. So we get it, we turn around, we give it. Well, there were two open or expired permits on the property. There was one for a fence. Now, that was easy because it actually was a mistake by the city. It wasn't supposed to be on our property. So we're able to kind of get that fixed and we can move on, not a problem. Um, Mara, if you have something to add in, please. I would love that. You'll have to unmute yourself. So we basically we pull the second permit, and that is for the roof. So the first thing to know about permits is not all of them are created equal. A fence permit, I don't really care that much about. A roof permit, I do care about. I care about it a lot. Okay, thanks, Mara. So I care about roof permits. I care about electrical permits, maybe pool, new additions, bathroom stuff, something that is significant that's going to be hard to verify whether it was done correctly. Those things I really care about because they're hard to get permitted after the fact. And the roof's kind of in between. It's a big deal, but it's not something that we can't overcome. The roof is a very expensive issue, but it's otherwise, we can handle roofs, but buyer really cared about it. So what did we do? Seller immediately called their contractor and said, "Hey, permit's still open." Unfortunately, the contractor didn't call them back, and we found out that the contractor was out of business and not willing to help. They had actually lost their license. Not good. So that was a dead end. As soon as you realize that the contractor is out of business, you really can't do anything with that contractor. Now, if they are still in business, most of the reputable roofing companies, they'll jump right on it and it won't cost the homeowner any money. You'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We'll call the county and get the final permits or the final inspections ordered. We'll get this resolved." That's what we were hoping. That was not what happened. So now we're at a dead end. Well, at the same time of all this, the contract had already expired for the inspection contingency. And as I told you at the beginning, this was an as-is FAR bar sales contract. So when the permit or when the inspection period ended, so did the ability to ask for the permit to be closed. And that is where the confrontation started. So to regroup, remember, the seller chose my office, and they didn't get their permit search back until at the end or after the inspection period had already expired. So the seller is probably, or the buyer is starting to think this was a setup. Dad, you ever heard that? Where the permit search came in after the inspection period?
It comes in all the time, and people just don't realize or forget that you only get one buyer selection, so you got to have it
Well,
online.
no, this is, yeah, I'm sorry, I set you up. This is an as-is contract.
Oh, okay. Sorry about
Yep,
that.
and buyer the buyer did not choose our office. The seller did. So the seller's paying title. So we get the permit search as a courtesy. We send it to everybody, and it's after inspections expire. So the buyer never really had a chance to ask for the seller to remedy these. Now, the seller tried to remedy them. They attempted, but it failed. And the seller said, you know what? Per the contract, I'm not obligated. Is that right? Are permits a title issue? Aren't they
It's
in
not,
something?
it's not a title issue, Christian. I think it even says it in there somewhere. And there's that statute that was passed in 2019 that ameliorates a whole bunch of the permit issues.
Well, don't let's, we're not jumping, we're not going to jump too fast. I'm trying to set up this scenario here.
Oh, it's definitely not a
So,
title issue.
so it's
People don't,
definitely not a title issue.
no way in God's green.
Permits are not a title issue. So there's our issue number one. Permits, or actually issue number one, the permit search came in after inspections. So the buyer really never had a chance to negotiate for the seller to fix them. Issue number two, the seller, out of, just kind of goodwill, tried to get these closed, got one of
Right.
them closed, but the other one dead end. And he's like, you know what? I'm kind of done. I'm out of town. I think the seller is in Canada. So they're really out of pocket. They can't really do much about it other
Yeah.
than
Right.
maybe hiring someone and spending some real money on this. So that's our issue. Number two is that, the seller's not really, they've kind of done enough, but they don't want to do any more. And then everyone starts getting really angry. The buyer starts thinking, well, I don't want to close with an open permit. I want out. Can the buyer get out?
No.
No, they don't have the right to get out. And, I think that is leading to issue number three. I don't know what number I'm on anymore, but issue number three is that I think they started to believe that the seller was doing this on purpose. The seller knew, and that I was helping them. That we purposely didn't get them their permit search until after the inspection period. This was a 7-day inspection period, and we didn't get it to them in that 7 days. It came in day 7 or 8 or maybe 9. Yeah, I don't think we got the contract until day 3 anyways.
But does the contract even say that it's the seller's duty to get a permit search to the buyer?
Well, it's the FAR bar as is contract, doesn't say anything.
So you have the seller providing title insurance in this case, or the buyer?
Seller chose us.
You know, Christian, when this first became a part of the contract, our underwriter, actually Old Republic, argued with me on whether or not we should even be doing these because it's beyond the scope of examining title. Like he said, you're just opening yourself up to exposure. You shouldn't be doing this, Don. And my response was, these buyers are going to be our future sellers, and I don't want them in my office foyer ticked off at me that they have a problem when they're trying to resell the property. So that's why I started doing them.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good idea you started doing them. We still do them today. And, I think not only can you just do the search, but now you have to try and answer their questions on how do you get these things closed.
Right.
So, just to reset the scene, contractually, And this is where buyer and seller and myself, we all started kind of hitting each other over the head because we all had different motivations. My motivation is to keep it as simple as possible. This was a courtesy. It's not a title issue, but we offered this. We found it. We wanted the buyer to know. We wanted the seller to know. We kind of want to be able to move on. Realistically, I'm trying to be lazy here. I don't want to do any more than that. Um, and then, and then the seller is not obligated to do it in my interpretation. They're not obligated to do it. So they don't want to spend a penny on this. They just want to sell. They just want to sell. They don't want to obligate themselves to anything extra. And the buyer's motivation is they want this property free and clear of any expired permits. Everyone has a very valid motivation. They really do. The problem is they're not on the same page. We're all in different pages. So that's our problem. How do we resolve it? That's the question, right? So in law school, they teach us IRAC. Do you remember? I don't know if this was something that you ever used, Dad, but IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. That's how we evaluate an issue, right? So
Sounds
the issue
hard.
number
Sounds
one,
hard.
find the issue. What's our issue? The issue is we've got to deal with this permit, or do we? Right? What do we do about the permit? Rules. Let's talk about rules. So the rule number one, permits are not a title issue.
Right.
They're just not. So Dad, if they're not a title issue, what are they?
Building code issue.
Yeah, they're an inspection issue.
Yeah.
They're an inspection issue. So if we look at the sales contracts, now we were using this FAR as is contract, and I will just tell you the only place it talks about permits, let's see if we can find it.
Something about helping out if you can.
There's a permit disclosure. Except as may have been disclosed by seller to buyer in a written disclosure, seller does not know of any improvements made to the property which were made without required permits, or those that have not been closed properly. So that's the first rule that we have to evaluate, which is, all right, did the seller know about this? Dad, in your experience, do sellers know whether the permits are closed or not?
Almost never. I mean, I'll use me as an example. We've owned our home 26 years. I have never done a permit search on it. I didn't do a permit search when I bought it for my father. I mean, your grandfather was a builder, and he may or may not have done certain things without following the appropriate channels. I just want to make sure the
Well,
thing
and
was.
I think, if you replace the roof, more often than not, the sellers who are paying for all this to happen, a lot of times they assume that the roofer has closed the permit. They just assume it's been closed.
I would assume it, and I would hire. I mean, the people, the people I work with. Don Condi, he was a friend. He's a friend of mine. I trust him. He's going to do a good job. That's really all I cared about.
Yeah, but we deal with a lot of people, and I would say majority of them, they don't go onto the county website to see if the permit was closed. Now,
No,
me, I did do that when because of how many issues we deal with on permits, I don't want that for myself personally. So while I had, before I paid the roofer their final payment, I made them give me confirmation that the permit had been closed. I did the same with our HVAC. Was the permit closed? Okay, here's your check.
right.
I think, in fact, on the HVAC, there was a question as to whether they even pulled the permit, and they're like, no, 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 we pulled the permit. Here it is. We got to close it out. We'll order the final inspection. But I will tell you, most sellers don't. So keep in mind with this disclosure, it has some relevance here, but it doesn't really mean that much for most people. For most people, they don't know. And that's what the case was in my scenario. In my scenario, the seller, if I can take him at his word, had no clue that the roofer didn't close the permit. No clue. Now, if he did have a clue, how would you disclose that? If you knew that the permit hadn't been closed, you do a seller disclosure. Simple, very simple. seller disclosure, or you could put it in an email, I suppose, but you need to tell the buyer, hey, this was not permitted. That's where this starts. But that's the only place that permits are referenced in this sales contract, right there. Now, if we go to, we're going to skip the FAR standard contract. We're going to look at the neighbor as is contract. Here's that one. And this is all in the guise of looking at the rules. We got to look at the rules. And rule number one is let's look at the contract, permits and violations. NABOR has the same disclosures for permits, basically that the seller does not know of any improvements to the property which are made without proper permits, or of any existing violations of local ordinances. So this doesn't even talk about open permits. It just talks about whether there was unpermitted work. I think that's really interesting. Or it says without proper permits. I suppose you can make the connection here, or certificates of occupancy, substantial completion where required. So I guess you could claim that if the seller is aware that there was an expired permit, they should disclose it. In the seller disclosure, it references it as well. Now, there's nothing else in this sales contract.
Is there something after the due diligence period, Christian? I thought there was something where the seller would cooperate, but at no expense.
I don't think so. No, because it doesn't talk about permits anywhere else.
Okay.
Now, where it does talk about permits is in the standard contracts, both FAR and NABOR.
Okay.
They are inspection items, right? So in NABOR, it's a defective item. So if we do that same thing, we search permit, we have the permit disclosure, and then it goes right into the inspections. Now, this whole section is missing in an as-is contract, but it's here for standard. So in the standard contract, you would itemize that this is an open permit or an expired permit. You would put it on your buyer election, and you would ask the seller to close it out.
Mm.
That's where it would be. This is not a title issue. It is an inspection issue. And it's the exact same thing in the FAR contract. In FAR, it is a, what's the terminology they use for FAR, Dad? Like a working item or non-working item? An expired permit falls under one of those big.
One of the three categories in paragraph 9.
Exactly. It doesn't, let's see, it has 24 references here. Maybe this is what you're talking about. Nope, that's not it. That's permitted. Nope, doesn't say anything there. No, there's nothing else in there that says that the buyer or the seller shall accommodate the buyer in getting a permit closed. Just doesn't reference it. So that's rule number one. We look at the contracts. It is not a title issue. It is an inspection issue. So let's keep that in mind for our conclusions, our analysis and our conclusions, right? So issue, that's our first rule. We're going to have to analyze that. We're going to have to look at some conclusions there. What are some of the other rules relevant to permits, Dad? Because you started talking about that.
Well, they added it to the contract in 2016. They passed the statute to deal with the deluge of open permits that were like 20 years old in 2019. It was referred to in one of your prior screen shows. It's that statute 553.79. It gives half a dozen different ways of dealing with open permits. One of which is that there can be no enforcement action against the buyer who buys in good faith in an arm's length transaction, both from enforcement action from the county and also if they're applying for a new permit for additional work.
Yeah.
So it means nothing to the buyer.
She kind of gets to that point. She says, how do we resolve these things? If all right, we know about the permit and the contractor's out of business, what do we do next? Well, it's important to know what our liability is, right? That's what you're getting into, Dad.
Right.
I don't want to jump into this and try to resolve it if it's going to cause a ton of liability. Should I be freaked out by this?
It depends on what the work is. If it's like an open permit on a shutter, which I was just talking to somebody about, that's over 10 years old, that's one issue. If it's about the roof that was finished last Tuesday, that's another, level of
Yeah.
concern.
So let's look at some of these statutes. So this one, 553.7916A, local enforcement agency, the permitting office, cannot deny issuance of building permit to an arm's length buyer solely because the permit of a prior owner was not closed. So it's a very important thing for a buyer to know, is that this is not going to sabotage the buyer on future work that they're trying to accomplish. If the prior owner had an old shutter that wasn't closed out, can they still get a permit to replace the pool, to put in a new air conditioning, to tear down the house?
Yeah,
This statute will protect the buyer from that. Additionally, the enforcement agency may not issue a notice of violation, fine, penalize, sanction, or assess fees against that buyer. So that's a really empowering thing for a buyer to know, that there's only so much problems that can come to them. There's no real liability as far as fines and violations and the inability to pull permits. I actually had that on a closing recently where the buyer was worried, hey, I'm going to do work to this house. I don't want them to give me a hard time. I can tell them, here's the statute. That would be unconstitutional for the county to penalize you in that same way. Now, there are other rules that we like as well, right, Dad? So this is
yeah.
553.7915C. That same permitting office may close a permit 6 years after issuance of the permit without an inspection, as long as the agency determines that no safety hazard exists. So in your example, Dad, maybe that fence, I don't know about shutters, it depends on the scenario, but a fence, there's probably no permit issue or safety issue regarding that permit.
Well, what I would
Worst case
see
falls.
this would apply to would be you'd have an open permit on an air conditioner that was like 20 years ago, and then you see after that time period an application for a new permit for an air conditioner, and that was properly CO'd. So in that situation, you can just say to the county, the old air conditioner isn't there anymore, so there's nothing for you guys to even look at. And the new one was properly applied for and CO'd, so there's no safety issue. So you could rely on
Yeah.
that section.
And that's a huge thing as well. That's another big tool for your tool belt, that if you have a subsequent permit for a replacement, the county will very easily just close out the old one. So we look at air conditioners in that way. If there was an old air conditioner from 20 years ago, but the new one was replaced, just in the last year,
Yeah.
well, they'll just close out the old one. I'm not even worried about
I
the
got a
old one.
ton of those, Christian, when this
We have
first
we always have a lot of those. So, but other than that, this statute, I will tell you, I don't know what a safety issue is, right? This
anything
gives
electrical.
the county a lot of leverage or a lot of leeway to determine whether they want to close it. And so I do want to get to that part, is how do you deal with the county? But there's another one that came out, Dad, and I was wondering if you could give me some feedback on this one.
Uh-huh.
5337915B. If the building permit is expired and the requirements have been substantially completed, the permit may be closed without obtaining a new permit, and the work required to be done may be done under the original building code that existed when the original permit was issued. This can be a significant benefit, avoiding the need to redo the entire project under a more stringent building code. Well, that's a good one. We like that one.
Yeah, it could be a door that was done, 10 years ago before they required impact doors or a window. Um,
Yeah.
so you don't have to get impact. These impact doors are expensive. So if you could,
Well, we use this a lot with when setbacks may change. So
right,
if there's a setback change that happened since the last work was done,
right.
or maybe it's not a setback, but like a minimum requirement between, the property line for a certain type of improvement, we can use the old law and their requirements to get this one closed out, which we like. Now, actually, this is the one I thought was very, very interesting. 5537915A allows the owner to close the permit by contacting the general contractor listed on the permit or hiring a new contractor to perform any remaining work. This is the one that I thought was excellent. And for my contractors that are listening, the new contractor is not liable for any defects in the work performed by the original contractor. That's huge. Because you can imagine, you've got this old permit. In fact, that's what's happening in my scenario. You've got this permit, the
Right.
old contractor is out of business. We need a new contractor to help us close it out, but they're freaked out. They don't want to overtake someone else's work. Even in my business, Dad, we don't just trust whatever the prior attorney did. We do a whole new search. We want to start from scratch. So this is a huge benefit, and every contractor needs to know this because they should be willing to take on this work, help that customer out, make some money off of doing this and providing that service without taking on a ton of liability for the prior work. I love that. Is that a new one, Dad?
No, this whole thing was 2019. And
That's
again, it was in
new.
direct
Yeah.
response to what we were going through down here. I mean, it was incredible, the amount of open permits that were really old.
I love that. I think that's incredible. So there's another rule. So these are our rules. So if we keep going back to it, permits are an inspection issue. They are not a title issue. So you need to make sure that you get everything done during your inspection period. Rules number two, the seller does have to disclose if they're
Mhm.
aware of those open expired permits, and you would put that on a seller disclosure. They do have to share that. But if they didn't know, there's really no obligation to do anything about these permits because they didn't know about it. And the only time the contract would require them is if you did some sort of buyer election or an amendment. And then if we look at the statutes, we see those rules. It protects a buyer who didn't know about this stuff from a prior owner. It protects a contractor who takes over the work from a prior contractor. And it gives some protections to the permitting office to just go ahead and close out certain permits that are no longer a safety issue or that have subsequently been replaced, which is really empowering. So those are our tools. But why is the buyer still freaked out? Why is the buyer still freaked out by the permit? Is it like that four-letter word mold, Dad? Is that
Yeah,
what this?
I honestly think people don't, it's not put in the proper context. It's not properly explained. I mean, I would always try to emphasize, this is what it is. It's a small item. Let's say it's the air conditioner. It was
Yeah.
20 years ago. So it's not an addition to the house or a roof job. The county can't do diddly to you. You can take care of it after closing if it bothers you that much. They might have had a problem with a permit in New Jersey or something. So they carry those past problems to these future situations. It's not a title issue. Your bank's not going to know about it. So they just don't understand it. They can't put it into context. Plus, in your initial scenario, when they're past the due diligence period, the deposit is on the line. So you're trying to get these people to calm down. It's not a big deal. It can be fixed later. A lot of times the realtor is quite effective at closing it out.
Yeah. So let's talk about, Julia had a question as to whether this is a defective item and how do you kind of notify that? It is a defective item. So this is the buyer election form. And I think it's the last thing on here, unpermitted improvements, non-conforming structures, open permits, and code violations. The existence of unpermitted improvements, non-conforming structures, open permits, or code violations related to the property. So yes, these are defective items, not only under NABOR standard, but under the FARBAR standard. These are one of those, in FARBAR, these are one of those three categories that a buyer can notify the seller, and then the seller has to go take care of it up to that limit that they have. So that's a good question, Julia. Definitely an inspection issue, definitely a defective item under the contract. Vicky had a question. What is the buyer's responsibility if it is not permitted and they close on the property with knowledge of no permit? And maybe I got to this question already. Is the seller obligated to get a permit after the fact? Example, someone added a screen lanai, not permitted, or replaced an air conditioner without a permit. So, Dad, you had mentioned, that they can't do diddly squat to a buyer.
If
right?
it's an open permit, not the unpermitted work.
Right. So unpermitted work is a little bit more challenging. And potentially an expired permit where they did it wrong could be somewhat challenging.
Right.
So let's say they added a bathroom in the downstairs and it wasn't permitted, and then they go, they try and permit it after the fact, or the city or the county finds out. Worst case scenario, if that was a new buyer who didn't do the work themselves, the county can't fine them, but I do believe the county can make you take that out. They can
Well,
make you
if
remove
it's
it.
downstairs, it's probably not living space, it's storage area. That's one of the most common.
Yeah, or if it's below the base flood elevation. So if it would violate FEMA requirements,
Yeah.
possibly they could make you remove it.
I
We saw
mean,
that a lot in City of Cape Coral, where people were doing work without permits after storms, and they were in violation of the FEMA 50% rule. So when the city found out, they had to come down really, really hard on some homeowners that did stuff without permitting.
I frequently would have buyers who would have bathrooms and kitchen areas and storage facilities was below the flood height that they were supposed to be at. They would take it out for the insurance guy to come by and issue insurance. And as soon as that insurance was, and they had a commitment for it, they would put the toilet back in and the kitchen back in. That they're willing to take the risk. And I can name names, but I probably shouldn't. Some of these things
Think that's how you come to conclusions on this stuff. So Julia had a follow-up question for us, but her question was whether this is a defective item, and I said yes.
yes.
And she said, but even though the statutes state differently, so these are different rules coming from different places. And one rule is going to be more restrictive or burdensome than others. So in this case, the state law is saying, all right, we're not going to penalize the buyer. We're going to protect them. We're going to give them options and abilities to close this out. Whereas the contract that NABOR provides or that FARBAR provides, they make it a defect. And they're like, no, 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 we want the seller to fix this. This is a defect. So yes, these are kind of competing things at times. And it's all in the guise of giving the buyer the chance to object to it. And the seller doesn't necessarily have to say yes in a NABOR contract, but kind of gives the buyer protection. So if they found this, they could get out of the deal if the seller refused.
There's a big difference, Chris, between statutes, federal law, state law, and contracts. And a classic example would be mold. There is no Florida statute on what's bad mold in the state. There's no national standard on what's bad mold. There's individual states that do different things. So it could be a law, but it might not be, it wouldn't be a law, but it could be a contract issue.
Yeah, it could be cultural, it could be kind of traditional.
Yeah.
So we've looked at the issue, we've looked at the different rules that are in apply, and then now we have to start making our analysis. We have to come to some sort of conclusion. So I'm going to give you guys here are the solutions here. How do we close this stuff out? It's driving us crazy. Okay. And then at the end, I'll tell you kind of what happened or what transpired in my closing and kind of what advice I had for people on it. So one option is you go down to the permit resolution desk personally and you ask how to close it. And it's great. You're going to look like a superstar at least half the time. It's amazing. I show up and I just go to the desk and I say, how do I close this permit? And they spend 10 minutes typing away at their computer and getting a printout and talking to their manager. And they come back and they say, all right, it's closed. And I'm like, I look like I'm amazing. How much can I charge for this? This is great. Anyone can do that. You cannot be afraid to go down to the county, talk to the permit resolution staff, and ask how to get it closed. If it falls under these easy ones where they can just close it out, maybe they had all the inspections, but they didn't pay the penalty or the little fee that was required, or maybe they just need maybe they need the insurance for the contractor because they let it expire. And as soon as they can get the insurance for the contractor, they'll stamp it approved, and all the permits are closed. That's step number one. Is you can always go down to the county yourself. You don't necessarily have to be the homeowner, although that's for 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time, you're going to need to do something. Excuse me. You're going to need to do something. And so the realtor really, and even the attorney, we can only do so much when it comes to that other half, but we can get that roadmap. So it's still important to go down to the county. And so that for that other half, they're going to give you the roadmap. They're going to say, all right, you need to make this permit. You have to apply for the extension. So that now you have an open permit as opposed to expired. And then you're going to have to, order these inspections, and they have to come out, verify the work was done correctly. And if it is, then they'll pass you and you'll get to pick up your certificate of completion. Or maybe they, if it's under a contractor who's currently active and has a license, you're going to have to get the contractor to do all that stuff. The contractor's going to have to extend the permit and then order the inspections, and then they can get their certificate of completion. So that's what, and I saw some of the people in the chat feature, they were talking about the permit queen and these permit resolution people. That's someone who does a very good job, knows the rules, knows how to get things done. But you can do this yourself. That's the goal. That's the key, is you can just go down to the office and figure it out yourself. In fact, I think it's the Collier County one. Excuse me. The
Right.
Collier County one is on Horseshoe Drive. I think it's 2800 Horseshoe Drive, which is
Right.
kind of right across from the Ford dealership here in Naples. And you just walk in, there's almost never a line. So that's goal number one. Just you can always go down. Goal number two, you can call the contractor. Goal number three, sometimes you have to hire another contractor. You have to hire another contractor who can put the permit in their name. They order the inspections, and then they can do the work that needs to be done. Now, Dad, if you have a neighbor contract and they put this on the buyer election, you say yes, you start the work, but it's not done by closing. What do? What happens?
Well, you're supposed to escrow 200% of the estimated cost to complete the work, and that's always a big argument because you don't know if they're going to close the permit or not. Whether you're going to have to rip it out and do something more expensive. So that's always arm wrestling with the other side.
Yeah, I hope it's not hugely confrontational, but it doesn't delay closing. That's the key.
No,
The
it doesn't.
seller needs to understand, yes, we're going to have to put some money in escrow, but we can still close. And the buyer needs to know that too. And we have to be very careful the words that we use.
If you're a
If you
bank
have a
involved.
buyer up front that, hey, we'll get this closed out and you won't have any problems and we'll delay closing until it's done. It's not the way the contract works. It's just not. Now, Dad, if you go back to my scenario, if you have an as-is contract, what are some tips you have for dealing with permits? Because they're not part of the contract already. How do we make them part of the contract?
Ah, well, let me.
I'll answer it for
Well,
you.
I did. I'll use a gentleman we both know. I'll use his first name, Marco. Marco was selling his old home on Marco Island. It was a $3 million sale. He happened to have a general contractor's license in New Jersey and did a lot of non-permitted work. So he asked me, Don, I got an offer. How do I counter? So I walked over to his house and we added to other terms and conditions that the buyer shall take title subject to the following non-permitted work. And we listed it. And the fact that the
You
seller
closed it.
it closed. It was a seller's market. They knew.
Yeah, you disclosed it.
Oh, and
So
the seller was a
here's the
contractor.
goal. Here are some of the keys that I was thinking. So if you're the buyer and you want the seller to remedy the permit, you're going to put it in an amendment. And you're going to simply say, seller shall close all open or expired permits prior to closing. And you can put that in the amendment, do it during your inspection, but I have one better. Just put it in your offer. Seller shall close all open or expired permits prior to closing. Put it in every offer. Put it in your standard contracts, put it in your as-is contracts, put it if you think there are no open permits, put it in anyways. It does not hurt you ever to put that in there now. And if the seller is going to question it and be like, oh gosh, I'm not signing that, I refuse, maybe I need to do a permit search for you.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an important conversation before we start spending money on inspections and I hire an appraisal and then I find out that there's an inspection. This all could have been saved, and that's my deal. This all could have been saved, the goodwill between the parties, if the buyer had simply put it in their offer that the seller was going to take care of this stuff prior to closing.
How about consequences if it's not closed by closing? Do you put something in on that?
Well, so I don't. I think, I don't want to overthink it. I'm just putting in an offer. But if you wanted to, you could say if it's not closed by closing, then seller shall escrow $10,000. The problem is we don't know what the work would be. So maybe you do 200% of the work, the estimated work, or $10,000, whichever is higher.
Yeah, you don't want the deal to fall apart. So you don't
Yeah,
want.
I wouldn't, I think that we have to keep our mind on, not freaking out the seller because we don't even know if there are open permits. I'm just putting it out there, hey, I want you to make sure that there's no open permits, that you
Yeah.
take care of this before closing. That's what I would do. I would put it in every offer. And so if you want that next tool for your tool belt, put it in every offer that the seller is going to take care of the permits. I think that's a no-brainer. Make it part of your contract. And then you never have to worry about whether my office gets it to you in time or did I include it in my buyer election. I'm just going to make you do it anyways, no matter what. It's a easy way to not mess up. That's, I think, a very important goal. So fast forward, my deal, and then I'm going to let you guys go. So in my deal, we found the roof permit. It's void. It needs to be reopened. They need to order inspections, and then assuming it passes inspections, it'll get closed out. Because the permit came in after inspections, the seller is not obligated under the contract to close these out. But the buyer did not take that very kindly. They thought that the seller was manipulating it. They thought that the seller knew about this permit. The roof had only been completed 2 years ago. And it was really hard because it started creating a wedge between the buyer and the seller really badly, and the brokers. And then I got pulled into it because I think they believed that I was delaying it on purpose. And that is not what we do, but I get it. I totally understand. Buyer was freaked out. So I got on the phone with the seller and the listing agent, and I simply said, I know you're not obligated to do this per the contract. And I know you say that you didn't know about this, but we have an opportunity to build some goodwill with this buyer by taking this over. And if we don't take this opportunity and we allow the buyer to just run wild with their imagination and freak out about, what this means and, drag us through the mud all the way till closing, if we even close, it's not going to be worth it. It's not going to be worth saving the $500 or the $1,000 to hire someone to do this for you. It's not going to be worth just going down to missing the ability to just go down to the county and getting this resolved yourself. You have to just make this a priority because if you don't, and this buyer terminates for some other reason, or they just drag their feet, or they throw their hands up and they let the deal go into arbitration, you're going to have to deal with this anyways, right? If we lose this buyer, you're going to have to close this permit. You've got a 2-year-old roof. We have to close this permit. I know you're not contractually obligated, but we need to act like we are. The contract isn't the most important thing. That's the conclusion. The
Not worth.
contract is not the most important thing. Closing is the most important thing. And if you don't close this one because you're trying to save $1,000, you're going to cost yourself way more than $1,000 in, holding cost, attorney's fees, whatever else it may be, something else breaking, and you might end up having to fix this yourself anyways. I think that was a very important conversation. And the hardest part was that that conversation, it was a little bit different than the first conversation. The first conversation the seller had with their listing agent was simply, you're not obligated to do this.
Right.
And so that's the seller just ran with it. I'm not obligated to do this. I'm done. I'll see you at closing. And then we had to pull them back. It's like, all right, I know you're not obligated, but we kind of have to do it anyways. And that's really tough. That's a very tough conversation to have. And so the lesson that I've learned from all of this, and I think everyone learned this lesson, is what you say matters. So be very careful. Very, very careful, because if we have to take that back or we have to redirect our client later, it's going to be a lot harder because they remember what you told them the first time. I've made that mistake several times, Dad. I'm not saying I necessarily made a mistake on this one, but we had to kind of
Oh,
act in that same way. That one's a wild one.
what was the deposit on that one,
Right
Chris?
there. Look at that. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question. All right, you're unmuted. Go for it. Nope, I don't hear you. I'm sure it's an excellent question.
What was the deposit, Christian?
Well, this is a $500,000 deal, and the
Okay.
deposit was maybe 10 or 20,000, but still very relevant amount of money for the buyer
Sure.
and the seller.
There's a
You know,
mortgage too, I'm sure.
I think that strategy matters and understanding the context of everything is very, very, very important, but not the whole picture, I guess. It's an interesting one. It's going to happen again. It's going to happen again, but there's a lot of power in, kind of knowing the steps, knowing that you can go down to the county in person, knowing that you can tell your buyer that you have some protection,
Mm.
that the buyer is going to be okay, that it should be straightforward to get this put into their name later. And maybe that's the last thing I'll leave you with. A homeowner, for most things, can put the permit into their name. They basically call it an owner builder.
Right.
So they take it out of the contractor's name and they put it in the homeowner's name so that the homeowner can order inspections and kind of order all that stuff through. There's certain exemptions that won't apply. If it's a condo, they won't let you put it into the homeowner's name. And that's a safety issue because you've got other condos that are attached to you. And if it's in an LLC, they won't let you put it into an owner's name. But if it's owned individually and it's a single family home, you can put it in the homeowner's name. Now, there is a law on the books that basically says if you do an owner builder permit, you can't sell the home for 1 year. I don't know how much that law is actually enforced or policed, but it's there. And so there's a little bit of trickiness. I don't always suggest that a homeowner put it into their name if we're in the middle of a closing.
I don't think
Instead, I would rather the buyer put it in their name after closing, and we can kind of go it that way because you're not planning on selling in the next year. You're planning on owning this home for extended period. So that's the last piece of it. Let's see, any other last questions? Where can we go online to check on outstanding or expired permits? So it depends on the municipality. So City of Marco Island has a portal that you can just type in the address and you can find elevation certificates, open permits, everything. City of Marco's got a great one. City of Naples has one, but you need a login. And then Collier County has one, which is also really great. You can just type in Collier County permits. You search by the property address. That's what we do. So that's where I would go, Anthony. And then Julia says, does that change the obligation to the seller to get an open permit report? No. If the seller doesn't know about an open permit, their obligation kind of ends. But if you want to be proactive, as you take a listing and you want to just run a quick report and make sure if there's going to be a permit issue, I love that idea. I think that's really great. The problem is if you find one, you're going to have to disclose it to your buyer. So be careful there. Should If so, Julia, yes, if you're putting it in an offer, it would make the seller obligate themselves to closing out that permit if they signed it. Absolutely. Lee County, I believe you have to have a login or a registration to pull Lee County permits. Um, we usually use a third-party service that pulls permits for certain areas, and Lee County is one of them. Cape Coral is one of them, and then we pull our own permits for Naples, Collier County, and Marco Island. But then you might have City of Bonita Springs. You could have City of Estero, and I think there's is there a City of Estero? I don't know.
I have no idea.
Who knows? It's right there. All right. Well, thank you, Dad. Thank you. I
Thanks, Chris.
appreciate it.
Take
Bye,
care.
guys. Good luck with everything.